My wife accused me of treating her like a puppet, but when I stepped back and gave her the independence she demanded, everything began to collapse. That was a question I'd asked 100 times before, the kind of mundane inquiry couples toss at each other without a second thought. We had just sat down to eat plates of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables between us, and I casually asked, "Did you remember to pay the credit card bill?" For a moment, her fork hovered in midair. She didn't answer right away, which I found odd. Normally, she'd just say yes or no, or even toss the question back with a quick "did you?" But this time, there was something different in the pause. Her hand slowly lowered the fork to her plate, her eyes fixing on me in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. "Why do you always do this?" she said, her voice sharp and louder than I expected. "Do what?" I asked, genuinely confused. "This." She gestured wildly at the table, as if it were a self-evident act. "Like you're my supervisor. Like I need to check in with you about every little thing. I'm not your puppet." Her words were a slap across my face, but I kept my expression neutral. Inside, though, a floodgate of emotions opened. Not because of what she said exactly, but because of how she said it. Her tone carried something deeper, something that had been simmering under the surface for a while. I just hadn't noticed or hadn't wanted to. "I wasn't checking on you," I said calmly, leaning back in my chair. "I was asking about a bill." Her face flushed as she shook her head. "It's not about the bill. It's about how you make me feel like I can't handle things on my own. Like you're always there to remind me to fix things before I even get a chance. Do you have any idea how suffocating that is?" Suffocating. That word stung more than I'd care to admit. It wasn't the first time I'd heard something along those lines, but I'd always brushed it off. This time, though, she wasn't just annoyed. She was livid. I took a deep breath, trying to keep the atmosphere from escalating further. "I wasn't trying to undermine you. I was just trying to make sure we didn't miss something important." She laughed bitterly. "And that's the problem. You think it's your job to make sure everything runs smoothly. You swoop in, take control, and leave me feeling like I'm some passenger in my own life." The room fell into a tense silence after that. I wasn't sure what to say, so I said nothing, which in hindsight might have made things worse. She picked at her food, barely eating, while I sat there, replaying her words in my mind. Each time they felt heavier, sharper. Eventually she stood up, grabbed her plate, and headed to the sink. "I'm done," she muttered, her back turned to me. "With the conversation or dinner?" I asked, my voice quieter now, though the sarcasm was unmissable. She didn't respond. Instead, she rinsed her plate and disappeared into the bedroom without another word. I sat there for a while, staring at the half-empty plates, wondering how we got to this point. Was she right? Had I been controlling? Or was this just an overreaction to an innocent question? The thought lingered as I cleaned up the table alone, the echo of her words following me around the kitchen like an uninvited guest. "I'm not your puppet." The phrase stuck with me, gnawed at me. She wasn't wrong to want independence, that much was clear, but the way she framed it, as if I had robbed her of some fundamental freedom, felt like an accusation I wasn't sure how to process. By the time I went to bed, the tension in the house was so thick, it felt like I had to push through it just to get under the covers. She was already asleep, or pretending to be, turned away from me, her breathing steady. I stared at the ceiling, not even bothering to close my eyes, trying to piece together what this meant for us, for me. Because, whether she knew it or not, her words had hit a nerve. Deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had a point. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. She moved around as though last night's outburst hadn't happened, but I could feel the tension lingering in the air like a storm that hadn't quite passed. Her tone was neutral, casual even, as she asked if I wanted coffee, but her eyes never met mine. I declined, choosing instead to observe her as she went about her morning routine. I couldn't shake the weight of her words from the previous night, suffocating, puppet, passenger. Those weren't accusations you threw around lightly. If that's how she truly felt, then maybe I'd been missing something bigger. And if she needed independence so badly, I decided I would give her exactly that. It wasn't spite or anger driving me. It was something colder, a calculated resolve. I wanted to test her words, to see if this was truly about independence or something else entirely. But I wasn't about to turn it into a spectacle. No declarations, no ultimatums. Just small changes, subtle shifts. She left for work first, as usual, and I lingered behind, sipping coffee and mentally running through our typical routines. There was a bill due that day, one I'd normally pay without a second thought. But this time, I left it untouched. She knew the due date just as well as I did. If independence was what she wanted, she'd handle it. The The first opportunity to test my resolve came sooner than I expected that evening. After she got home, she casually mentioned the water heater acting up again. Normally, I'd have been halfway to the garage for my tools before she finished her sentence, but this time, I stayed seated. "Maybe you should call someone to take a look at it," I said, keeping my tone as light as possible. Her head tilted slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "I thought you'd just fix it." I shrugged. "I figured you might want to handle it." There was no immediate pushback, just a pause that stretched a little too long. Then she nodded, almost to herself, and left the room. I heard her on the phone later, calling a plumber, her voice clipped and efficient. She handled it. Over the next few days, I continued to step back in ways that felt unnatural, even uncomfortable. Little things I'd normally do without a second thought, I let them fall to her, filling up the car, picking up groceries, even handling a call from the bank about a minor account issue. Each time she took care of it, but not without a look or a comment that hinted at her growing frustration. One evening, she finally asked, "Is something going on? You've been different." I shrugged again, pretending to be engrossed in my laptop. "I just thought it might be nice to step back a little. You said you didn't want me micromanaging, so I'm trying to give you some space." Her expression shifted, but she didn't press the issue. "Right," she said quietly before turning her attention back to her phone. Privately, I was keeping score, though I'd never admit it out loud. Every missed appointment, every minor inconvenience she had to deal with on her own, it all reinforced my belief that she was unprepared for the independence she claimed to want. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was hollow. Each small victory only seemed to deepen the gap between us. The turning point came later that week when she came home visibly drained. She dropped her bag by the door and sighed as she kicked off her shoes. "The car insurance payment bounced," she said flatly, her voice edged with frustration. "I thought you handled that," I said, not even looking up. "Nope," she said, staring at me, her mouth slightly open as if trying to decide whether to argue. But instead of speaking, she shook her head and walked to the kitchen. I heard her muttering under her breath as she sorted through the folder, finally finding what she needed. As I sat there, listening to her grumble about account numbers and hold times with customer service, I couldn't help but wonder if I was crossing a line. Was this proving a point, or just setting her up to fail? That night, as we lay in bed, I noticed for the first time how much quieter the house had become, not just in the absence of conversation, but in the way we moved around each other, careful, calculated, almost like strangers sharing a space. The silence was suffocating, but I wasn't ready to break it just yet. She wanted independence, and I was determined to let her have it, even if it cost us both more than we'd bargained for. The following morning, the air between us was colder than ever. She moved around the house with precision, her actions clipped and deliberate. I could tell she was determined not to let the tension get to her, or at least not to let it show. As for me, I stuck to my silent resolve. I wasn't going to backpedal. Not now. She wanted to take control of things, so I would let her. It didn't take long for the first cracks in the new routine to appear. The trash was piling up in the kitchen, something I'd normally handle before she even noticed. This time, I left it alone. She noticed. I saw her glance at it as she grabbed her coffee cup, her lips tightening into a thin line. But instead of saying anything, she walked out the door, leaving it untouched. Later that day, she texted me, "Did you pay the internet bill? It's due today." I stared at the message for a moment before replying, "Nope, folder's in the kitchen, you've got it." Her response was brief and curt, "Fine." By the time she came home that evening, I could see the strain starting to show. She tossed her bag under the couch and immediately opened her laptop, diving into a list of overdue tasks. I stayed out of her way, watching from the sidelines as she tried to juggle everything I typically managed without her even noticing. It was strange to see her like this, frustrated, tired, invisibly struggling. A part of me felt vindicated, but another part felt uneasy. Was this what I wanted? To see her flounder? The first major test came when she realized the pantry was nearly empty. Normally I'd have stocked up on groceries over the weekend. This time I didn't even mention it. As she rummaged through the cabinets, I could hear the irritation in her movements, the slam of a cupboard door, the clatter of a cereal box being shoved aside. "We're out of milk," she said finally, her voice strained. "Yeah, I noticed," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Figured you'd want to handle the shopping this week." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she grabbed her keys and muttered something under her breath before heading out the door. When she returned an hour later, her arms full of grocery bags, she didn't say a word to me. The silence spoke volumes. The days stretched on like this, each one adding another layer of tension to the house. She was handling things, yes, but not without visible cracks. The car needed gas. The laundry sat in the hamper longer than usual, and the bills were piling up on the counter. She wasn't used to managing it all, and it showed. But she didn't ask for help, not once. One evening I found her sitting at the dining table, her laptop open and a stack of papers spread out in front of her. She was squinting at an online form, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she muttered to herself. It was a bill payment, something she'd normally never have to worry about. "Need help?" I asked, my voice calm but deliberately detached. She glanced up at me, her expression a mix of exhaustion and defiance. "No," she said quickly. "I've got it." I nodded and walked away, but I could hear her sigh as I left the room. It wasn't a sound of defeat. It was a sound of frustration, of someone who was learning just how much effort it took to keep everything running smoothly. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't help but replay the day's events in my mind. She was holding up, barely, but it was taking a toll. The once confident, self-assured woman I married was now stumbling under the weight of responsibilities she hadn't prepared for, and yet she refused to admit it. The house began to feel different in subtle ways. Tasks I once took care of without her noticing were now glaringly absent. The overflowing trash, the unswept floor, the dishes in the sink. They all became silent reminders of my absence in the equation. And while she tried to pick up the slack, her efforts were inconsistent at best. Still, I said nothing. I let her handle it. After all, this was what she wanted, wasn't it? Independence, freedom, the ability to prove she wasn't my puppet. But as the days went on, I started to wonder, was this about her proving something to me, or about me proving something to her? The line between the two was starting to blur, and I wasn't sure which side I was standing on anymore. The unraveling of our routine was subtle at first, but it was becoming impossible to ignore. The small cracks in our dynamic had grown into visible fissures. The tension between us was no longer contained in quiet glances or clipped tones. It seeped into every corner of our lives. I stayed firm in my decision to step back, but I hadn't anticipated how far the ripple effects would go. The breaking point came one afternoon when I noticed her pacing in the living room, phone in hand. She had a look I knew well, frustration masked by determination. I didn't ask what was wrong, but I could hear snippets of her conversation as she navigated an increasingly agitated tone. Something about our joint insurance policy. After she hung up, she tossed the phone onto the couch and exhaled sharply. "Why didn't you respond to the emails from the insurance company?" she asked, her voice teetering on the edge of accusation. "What emails?" I asked, feigning indifference. "The ones about renewing our car insurance," she snapped. "They've been sending reminders for weeks." "I assumed you'd handle it," I said simply, keeping my tone calm. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You always handle this stuff. Now they're saying the policy expired, and I have to figure out how to reinstate it. They're charging extra fees because we missed the deadline." I shrugged. "You have their number. It shouldn't be too hard to fix." The color drained from her face, leaving only a mix of shock and anger. "You're unbelievable," she muttered, grabbing her laptop and storming off to the dining table. I could hear her typing furiously, her frustration palpable even from across the room. The following hour was a symphony of short, curt phone calls and the click of her keyboard. I could tell she was hitting roadblocks. Our insurance was something I'd always taken care of, a system I had streamlined over the years. Now, with her trying to navigate it from scratch, the inefficiencies were glaring. Eventually, she slammed her laptop shut and stormed into the kitchen. "This isn't independence," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "This is sabotage. You're setting me up to fail." "I'm not setting you up for anything," I replied. "I'm giving you the freedom you wanted." Her laughter was bitter. "Freedom? This feels more like punishment." I stood up, leaning against the doorway to meet her glare. "You wanted control, and I stepped back. You can't have it both ways." Her jaw tightened, and she looked away, her shoulders tense. "You don't get it, do you?" she said finally. "You're just sitting there, letting me clean up the mess you left behind." "It's not my mess," I said calmly. "It's ours. I'm just not the one fixing it anymore." The conversation ended there, but the silence that followed was deafening. She eventually returned to her laptop, determined to solve the issue on her own. I could see her resolve, but I could also see how exhausted she was. That evening she barely spoke to me, the weight of the situation etched into her face. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. Watching her struggle wasn't satisfying. It was uncomfortable. But I told myself it was necessary. This was about balance, about proving a point, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. By the end of the night, the insurance issue was resolved, but at a cost. She looked drained, her usual confidence shaken, as she went to bed without saying a word. I sat in the quiet of the living room, replaying the events of the day. For the first time, I wondered if I had taken things too far. I wanted to give her independence, but was this what it was supposed to look like? The cracks in our relationship weren't just affecting her. They were starting to affect me too, and yet, I wasn't sure how or if we could fix them. Days of stifled frustration and passive avoidance had built a wall so thick that even the smallest exchange felt strained. I kept expecting her to say something to break the cycle, but she didn't, and I wasn't about to cave either. We were both too proud, too stubborn to admit the cracks were widening. That was until one evening when everything came crashing down. It started innocently enough. She came home late, her shoulders slumped in a way that told me she'd had a rough day at work. I glanced up from the couch, where I'd been sitting with my laptop, and noticed she was carrying takeout bags, an unusual move for her. Normally, she'd make a point of cooking, even when she was tired, as if it were a quiet act of defiance. But not tonight. She set the bags down on the counter and sighed, looking at the unopened mail piling up next to them. "Have you at least gone through these?" she asked, gesturing to the stack with a tired wave of her hand. "No," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Figured you'd handle it." Her head snapped up, and for the first time in days her eyes met mine directly. "Seriously?" she said, her tone sharp. "How long are you going to keep this up?" I put my laptop aside and leaned back on the couch, meeting her glare with a calm that I didn't entirely feel. "Keep what up?" I asked, though we both knew exactly what she meant. "This," she said, her voice rising. "This thing you're doing, acting like you're some passive observer while everything falls apart around us." "I'm not acting," I said simply. "I'm giving you the space you asked for." Her laugh was bitter, almost hollow. "Space? That's what you're calling it?" "No, this isn't space. This is you abandoning everything because I dared to say I didn't want to feel like a puppet." "Abandoning?" I repeated, my tone hardening. "You said you wanted independence. That's all I've done, given you what you wanted." She stepped closer, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "You're not giving me independence. You're punishing me. You're sitting back and watching me drown while you pat yourself on the back for being so fair." Her words hit harder than I cared to admit, but I didn't flinch. "I'm not punishing you," I said, my voice steady. "I'm showing you what it looks like when I step back. You said you felt suffocated. Fine. Now you're in control, but control comes with responsibility." Her eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment it looked like she might say something cutting, but instead she turned away, gripping the edge of the counter as though steadying herself. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter but no less intense. "You don't understand, do you? You've spent so much time being the one in control that you don't see what it feels like to have everything dumped on you at once." "That's what I've been dealing with for years," I shot back. "You think it's easy carrying the weight of everything, making sure the bills are paid, the house is running, and your life is as smooth as possible. You never even noticed how much I did because you didn't have to." She spun around, her face red with frustration. "You think I didn't notice? Of course I noticed. But I didn't ask for you to take on everything. You chose to do that, and then you resented me for it." "I didn't resent you," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. I didn't know how to say no. And now, when I try to step back, this is what happens." She stared at me, her expression a mix of anger and something else I couldn't quite place. "This isn't stepping back," she said finally. "This is tearing everything down to prove a point." The room fell into an uneasy silence. For the first time in weeks, I could feel the weight of what we were doing to each other. This wasn't just about bills or chores. It was about the very foundation of our relationship, and that foundation was starting to crack. She shook her head and walked away, leaving the takeout on the counter. I stayed in the living room, staring at the spot where she'd stood, her words echoing in my mind, tearing everything down to prove a point. Was that what I was doing? Or was I just trying to make her see things from my perspective? Either way, it didn't feel like balance anymore. It felt like destruction, and I wasn't sure how much more either of us could take. She left the room that night without another word, the sound of her retreating footsteps echoing in the silence. I didn't follow her. Instead, I stayed in the living room, staring blankly at the table where the unopened takeout bag sat like a monument to our unresolved tension. The house felt heavy, weighed down by everything we had said and everything we hadn't. I don't know how long I sat there, replaying the confrontation over and over in my mind. Her words haunted me. This isn't stepping back. This is tearing everything down to prove a point. Was she right? Had I taken things too far in trying to teach her a lesson, or was this just the inevitable fallout of years spent on autopilot, letting resentment quietly fester? The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. She had already left by the time I woke up, and the absence of her usual morning routine hit me harder than I expected. The kitchen, once bustling with shared rituals like brewing coffee and trading quick morning conversations, now felt sterile. As I poured myself a cup of black coffee, I noticed something unusual on the kitchen table: a stack of papers, bills, account statements, and even a notebook with handwritten notes in her familiar scrawl. At the top of the pile was a sticky note. "Can we go through these together tonight?" I stared at the note for a long time, the simple question unraveling something inside me. It wasn't an apology, but it wasn't defiance either. It was a gesture, a small tentative step toward reconciliation, and for the first time in weeks I felt the tiniest crack in my resolve. When she came home that evening, she looked tired but determined. There was no tension in her shoulders, no sharpness in her tone. She walked into the kitchen, saw me sitting at the table with a pile of papers, and paused for a moment. We just looked at each other, neither of us sure what to say. Finally, she sat down across from me, her expression guarded but hopeful. "Thank you for sitting down with me," she said, her voice soft but steady. I nodded. "I think we need this." We started sorting through the mess together, dividing tasks and clarifying what needed to be done. At first, the conversation was purely logistical: numbers, due dates, and account details. But as the evening went on, the conversation shifted. "I didn't realize how much you were handling," she admitted, her tone almost apologetic as she flipped through a particularly complicated bill. "I thought I understood, but I didn't." I hesitated before responding. "I didn't realize how much pressure I was putting on you either," I said finally. "I thought I was helping, but maybe I wasn't." She looked up at me then, her expression softening. "I never wanted you to feel like you had to do everything," she said. "I just wanted to feel like I had a say in how things were done." "And I never wanted you to feel like your independence didn't matter," I replied. "I just didn't know how to let go without feeling like I was failing." The honesty hung between us, fragile but real. For the first time in weeks, we weren't talking at each other. We were talking to each other. The conversation wasn't easy, and it wasn't pretty. We both had things to say that hurt, things we had avoided addressing for years. But as difficult as it was, it felt necessary. Slowly, we began to piece together a new understanding of what our relationship needed to be. Not one where one of us carried the other, but one where we shared the load. That night, after we finished going through the bills, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. It wasn't an apology, but it was something better, a sign that we were finally on the same page. "I don't want to keep fighting like this," she said quietly. "Neither do I said, "but we need to figure out how to move forward together." She nodded, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimmer of the partnership we used to have. It wasn't a perfect resolution, far from it. We still had a long way to go. But for the first time, it felt like we were both willing to try. That night, as we went to bed, the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't the suffocating, bitter silence of the past few weeks. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are finally ready to listen. And for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we'd be okay. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.